A bound edge is a standard finish for a knit top. It's neat, durable, and stretchy. For visual emphasis and a sturdy, cleanly finished edge, try a double binding technique. This starts as a standard binding at the neckline and continues into a double banded feature at the garment's center front seam. Start by cutting off the seam allowances on the edges you plan to bind, the neckline and center front seam. If your pattern doesn't have a center front seam, you can create one by splitting the pattern along the fold line. Don't add seam allowances. Then measure from center back, around the neck and down the seam. Double this length to calculate the full binding strip length. Cut a cross-grain strip of knit fabric to this length. Piece the strip if needed. For 1/2 inch wide binding, make the strip 2 inches wide. Pin the binding to the edges. With right sides together, sew it along both center front edges and around the neckline in one pass. Use a 1/2 inch wide seam allowance. Press the seam allowances toward the binding. Next, pin the center front seam. With right sides together, pin the binding strips together, placing the pins parallel to the binding's cut edges. Place the work under the presser foot. For even stitching, fold the underneath seam allowances to the left and set the needle right beside the top seam allowance edge. Stitch the seam, following the seam allowances, but not catching them in the seam. Sew from the neckline end toward the hem. Press the seam allowances open. Then, at the neckline, press the binding over the seam allowances to the garment's interior. From the right side, pin the binding strips. Then, stitch in the ditch of the seam to secure the binding. Finally, trim the excess binding just beyond the stitching. Your double binding seam provides an attractive style line at the center front and a clean finish inside the garment.